Washington Journal continues.
We are going to talk about a bill this week in the House looking at federal funding of stem cell research. We are joined by two guests. Dr. David Prentice is the Senior Fellow for Life Sciences at the Family Research Council. We are also joined by Dr. Stephen Teitelbaum, of the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Dr. Teitelbaum, in essence, what did this House bill call for?
Well, it calls for an expansion of the right to use stem cell lines to study the potential of new therapies for patients with devastating diseases like multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, spinal cord injury, diabetes. To my mind, what it does, it says we as a country are now going to make a commitment to help those patients, those individuals, our relatives, my patients as a physician, who are the most susceptible in our society, the most unfortunate. It's a statement about us as Americans being concerned about our neighbors who have diseases which make their lives miserable.
Dr. Prentice, how does this differ from the President's previous statement on stem cell funding?
Well, what this bill would do would be to open up many more embryos in terms of possible destruction and then federal funding of those particular stem cell lines. And so it goes well beyond the President's policy that started in 2001, which limited federal funds to research on just a few human embryonic stem cell lines.
And your main concerns about the opening up of the lines of research?
What it looks like it would do is create an incentive to destroy more embryos for research. And in point of fact, it's focused, this particular bill, on the frozen embryos, the so-called leftovers, the small percent that might be available for research at fertility clinics. But it's really not going to expand in terms of potential disease treatment a great deal.
And Dr. Teitelbaum?
Well, of course, I think Dr. Prentice, if you're active in a laboratory, you know that one can never predict science. Science is knocking on 20 doors hoping to find gold behind one of them, and you never know that until you do the science. So to be able to say something is going to work or not going to work is emblematic of not being in a laboratory. Science is asking questions, and we will never know whether or not something works or doesn't work until we do the science. I'll point out that these are embryos, or these structures that will be destroyed are pinpoint-sized balls of cells that would be destroyed anyhow. They would be flushed down the toilet. They are spare embryos. There are 400,000 of them in the country. They're frozen away. They are excess embryos that are produced during the course of in vitro fertilization. And there are arguments that they can be adopted. Well, in the last 5 years, despite the fact that there's $1 million each year spent for proposing adoption, only 129 of the 400,000 have been adopted. So we're really asking the question about whether or not a ball of cells in a dish, which are not lung, not brain, not heart, whether this ball of cells, using this ball of cells, is or is not worth the cure, the potential cure, because we're talking about promise. All forms of therapy, any drug that is being developed is always just as promise. Whether or not we should use these cells for the promise of curing these our fellow citizens. Dr. Prentice is certainly entitled to his position, his ethical position, that we should not be doing it. But one should not do, and does not have the right to do, is to fortify one's ethical position with disinformation.
What would be the position that you would take on, he says, the elimination of cells that would be eliminated anyway?
Well, there's no doubt that out of those 400,000, some few thousand are discarded. We often hear the misleading phrase that all 400,000 are open for this particular research. And the RAND Corporation did a study in 2003 that showed there are only 11,000 of those. Out of those, you'd only get about 275 dishes or lines of cells. One of the concerns has been that the current lines that are available for the basic research, the President approved federal funding for back in 2001, are contaminated. They're not good for research anymore. There have been several published studies that disprove that. In fact, Jamie Thompson, the original person who grew human embryonic stem cells in the lab, has shown that the contamination can be removed. 85% of the publications on human embryonic stem cell research use those so-called contaminated lines. Our position would be, number one, there is an ethical line that we're drawing that we should not be destroying embryos for the purpose of research. Personally, my opinion would be none of the embryos should be destroyed. But also in terms of the science and moving the science forward, that there is federal funding available, there are adequate cell sources available, and it would be nice to see those used, move forward, see whether the research can actually accomplish its stated goals.
Our guests are going to be with us, and if you want to ask them questions, the numbers will be on your screen as we talk about this funding for stem cell research legislation that was taken up in the House this week. I call the numbers that best represent you. Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, you're first. Good morning.
Hey, how you doing? Love C-SPAN, and I think you're really working on a great thing here to get it out to the American people exactly what has happened. The Dr. Tannenbaum, he is with a witch hunt, is what he is. See, this is all a witch hunt about trying to find a cure for people, which there's no scientific evidence of any kind of cures coming from stem cell. And he wants the federal government and pad people's pockets. That's what this guy wants. He don't want to cure people. There's a lot of people out here that can complain, like Michael Fox and all these guys, to complain about their Parkinson's disease, and it's just irrelevant because there's no scientific evidence that this works. And
No scientific evidence, Dr. Tannenbaum.
Well, firstly, what we're talking about here are patients. I'm a doctor. I will tell you that I was part of a team that first used adult stem cells to cure a child with a fatal disease of bone. I did this in the early 80s. I was just a kid. I was an assistant professor at university. And this is using adult stem cells. Here I am, a guy, a proponent of all forms of stem cell research, and I'm talking about adult stem cells. Why? Because of the limitations of using these cells, we can only cure less than 10% of my patients with these diseases. And we're not talking about stem cells here. We're talking about patients. We're talking about the most vulnerable members of our society. The caller says that I don't want to cure patients. That's what I've done all of my life. I'm a doctor. I'm concerned about patients. I see them. I'm a bone doctor. I see those who have devastating diseases of bone. My goal is to cure patients. Now, parenthetically, Dr. Prentice, again, it's this disinformation issue. These lines that have been available are not adequate. They are just not adequate. They have been contaminated. They have been placed in cultures with mouse cells. They have proteins on their surface that prevent them from being used. Now, could they be modified? I don't know, and I want somebody to do the science. Once again, Dr. Prentice, you don't get there unless you ask the question. You must do the science. Good science is counterintuitive. People don't win the Nobel Prize by making predictions. They win the Nobel Prize by asking counterintuitive questions. We don't know, and we will never know unless we do the science.
Dr. Prentice?
Well, you know, Dr. Teitelbaum keeps coming back to these lines and disputing this fact that, yes, the contamination is there, but it can be removed. There are published scientific papers that are not brought up in terms of the ability to remove the contamination from these cells. In fact, the company that's leading in the human embryonic stem cell research, Geron in California, intends to use, if it can get to the point of clinical trials, those particular cells. And the CEO, Thomas Okarma, has made a statement on record that if you don't know how to get rid of that contamination and use them, that's just hogwash. You just don't know what you're doing.
Davis, California, good morning.
Hi. I'd just like to know how the pro-life people can, pragmatically justify their position on it. This is not a thinking being. It doesn't think about anything. It doesn't have a soul per se. Any more than a chicken or something like that. Why don't they care about all these animals we slaughter for eating and stuff like that? Why don't they care about those?
Dr. Prentice.
Well, the basic biological fact is we were all an embryo at one point in time. You're making an ethical distinction, and your position is that this very early stage of human life does not have moral value. But there's a large segment of the country that does believe that even at that earliest stage of our life, that has some moral value and shouldn't be sacrificed for particular research experiments. So, you know, a large segment of the country believes that that is not certainly something that we should be doing. An even larger segment of the country that we shouldn't be using taxpayer funds for that particular type of embryo destruction.
Why not just let the private industry fund this and not the federal government?
Well, the great science in our country is done by federal funding through the National Institutes of Health. That's how we make our great advances. And I happen to agree with Dr. Prentice that this is a values issue. This is not a scientific issue, because what a human being is not a scientific definition, it's a values definition. And certainly those individuals who believe that a pinpoint-sized ball of undifferentiated cells is a human being have every right to do so. However, the majority of Americans don't. And of course the concern is, does a minority of Americans have the right to force their opinion on a majority of Americans? And you know, regarding this issue about these embryonic stem cell lines, once again, Dr. Prentice is predicting science. We don't know if we can use these lines or we can't use these lines. All we want to do is have 100 flowers bloom. Let's do it all. Let's find out what works best. I don't care if adult stem cells work best, if embryonic stem cells work best. I just want to cure my patients. That's all I care about.
St. Petersburg, Florida, good morning.
Hello, my name is Dr. McCaleb. I'm a practicing neurosurgeon, a former academic researcher at a university, did gene therapy research for spinal cord injury, routinely take care of patients who die or disabled, and I understand the problems. However, I believe, as Dr. Teitelbaum appropriately points out, that this is an ethical problem. And unfortunately, folks in his position, in the position I was in, and my wife, who's also a researcher, are not qualified to make these decisions, and sadly we're being asked to drive this decision. Well, the problem is an ethical one. It's when you decide when human life begins. And if we're going to be willing to experiment on, as we call, a pinpoint of cells that can turn into a human being, then when does the slippery slope stop? When do you say, well, you know, that woman was going to have an abortion anyway, and we might as well take her fetus? Or I know, for instance, if you gave me 5,000 patients, that I could probably experiment on those human beings and cure many, many diseases, but is that right? I don't think that the scientists who are driving this are without conflict of interest. They do receive a lot of funds. I do believe the private sector is able to do this, not just the government. The government is not the end-all, be-all of science. And I believe that in the end, this is an ethical problem, and the society needs to comment on and prevent the slippery slope of human experimentation.
Dr. Teitelbaum.
Yes, I agree. We have to prevent abuse. And for example, in the state of Missouri, we just passed a ballot initiative that specifically prohibits the implantation of a particular form of embryo that is generated in the petri dish, if you will, into a woman, to a uterus. And a woman's uterus, and we must be careful about ethics. Absolutely, I agree with the call fully, and American people have to be fully engaged in this. But you know, we have had this slippery slope argument put before us before. In the late 80s and early 90s, when we first started doing genetic engineering and starting to be able to work with genes, there were these cries of monster making. We're going to do terrible things. Well, the terrible things turned out to be the ability to produce fabulous drugs by genetic engineering. So we have gone through this sort of episode. We've done it with smallpox vaccination. You know, when smallpox vaccination was first established, was first developed, there was great opposition. In fact, there was a smallpox epidemic in Montreal in the 19th century, and the people who died were those who were told that because of religious reasons they should not receive smallpox vaccination. We must move forward. We must help those individuals who are the most susceptible in our society. Those individuals who, and the good caller is a neurosurgeon. He deals with the kind of people that we're talking about. And I'm sure as a physician, he has great sympathy for those people. I see patients. I'm involved with them. I want them to be cured. I think that if we're going to compare a child with diabetes to a ball of cells in a petri dish, I believe that the pro-life position is in favor of that child with diabetes.
If I could just make a comment on a couple of things Dr. Teitelbaum said. Our topic is the current bill at the federal level rather than the Missouri amendment, which there are those who would disagree about the ethics of that and creating human cloned embryos rather than implanting them. But he brings up the genetic engineering history, and it's interesting if you look back at that history. Scientists themselves called a meeting and placed a moratorium on all of that research until they could justify the research and satisfy the ethical concerns of the citizens and the government. We're not seeing that in terms of the current embryonic stem cell debate. What we're seeing is a rush ahead to go ahead and, as this bill would do, open up more embryos for destruction.
253 to 174 in the House, including, according to some reports, like 18 more or so Republicans adding. What does that suggest to you as far as how the vote went and who participated?
18 more votes by most counts. Some of those were Republicans. There were, I believe, 3 that switched their votes from last time. Some were gains in the Democratic column due to the elections. It's interesting, though, that there were 16 Democrats that voted against this particular bill. It wasn't the sort of momentum and landslide that we keep hearing about from the elections. What I think we're seeing is an incremental change. In a sense, this particular round for this bill is an exercise in politics rather than patience, because they don't have enough votes to override a presidential veto, which has already been promised. We don't know whether they'll get enough votes to do so in the Senate. You know, this obviously is not going away anytime soon, but it's not an issue that's going to be passed in the near future.
Our next call for our guest, Westchester, Pennsylvania. Good morning.
Morning. Dr. Prentice, this is primarily for you. You do not want to see embryos destroyed for the sake of research. However, as people know that they are being discarded, you know, because the parents no longer want them, why are not the pro-life people out there demonstrating about destruction of these embryos now? They're being discarded. Why isn't there attention drawn to that? Why are you only upset about these embryos being destroyed for the use of scientific research if they're being destroyed now? I see a lot of inconsistency, and what I see that a process that's happening now with the destruction of these embryos only becomes a convenient argument against stem cell research. If you're truly against the destruction of embryonic stem cells, you would be just as upset about them being discarded.
And I'd agree with you that those should not be discarded as well. I think I stated that earlier. Personally, that's my position. There are actually a number of people who have spoken out in terms of any of that embryo destruction going on. Dr. Teitelbaum mentioned the one particular embryo adoption program, the Snowflakes, which has only had 129 of those adopted. But there are a number of other programs around the country doing that. Hundreds of those embryos have been adopted. And again, my position would be we should be concerned about that. We should be looking at that particular wastage, if you will, and we should address that issue as well.
Well, what Dr. Prentice is doing is saying that in vitro fertilization should not take place because
I disagree with that.
Excuse me, Dr. Prentice. Because by its very nature, in vitro fertilization produces more embryos than will be used. So your position then is consistent with the fact that test tube babies should not be born.
No, that's not the case. And in fact, if you look at the newer research, which I support,
may I finish, please? May I finish, please? May I finish, please?
Finish point.
Thank you. Yes. So there is any respectable investigator in vitro fertilization will say that it is virtually impossible to do effective in vitro fertilization without producing excess blastocysts or embryos.
There are
secondly,
one more point, and then Dr. Prentice, you can respond.
Right, yes. Secondly, we have recently at Washington University done a survey of donors, of parents who have had excess embryos. Once they understood what stem cell research is about, 97% of them, 97% said that they would be willing and pleased to donate those excess embryos for research.
It would be interesting to see how the questions were phrased, because like most polls, it's always a question of how the question is phrased to the interviewee. But there are dozens of clinics around the country as well as around the world now who practice what's called natural IVF, where the women aren't subjected to the high doses of hormones. There are a number of studies now published by eminent researchers showing that even just one embryo implanted can achieve a pregnancy at the same or a higher rate of efficiency than creating dozens of embryos at a time. And in fact, most clinics are moving towards that because it's gentler on the woman. It certainly does not cross this sort of ethical problem that we're dealing with now.
You can make a quick response if you want, but
I think Dr. Prentice needs an MD, frankly. I think his data are dead wrong.
St. Croix, Virginia.
You mean Virgin Islands?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, gentlemen. I have a couple questions. First of all, for the fellow with the little flag on his lapel, every time I see that, a little red flag goes up. Anyway, there are billions of people who go to sleep every night hungry. What's your problem with a couple of little dots in a Petri dish? That's number one. Number two, it's another way to control women, even their embryos. And number three, I have a question for Dr. Teitelbaum. Doctor, I don't know how to say this, and I wanted to say it for a long time. And I've been watching C-SPAN and calling and calling and calling. And I just, by looking at you, I think you might understand what I'm trying to say. I'm just a little old lady. I'm 67 years old. I have two sons. One son is a primary school principal. The other one has mental illness and lives here in the Virgin Islands. Doctor, I've been looking at our president, and I have experience with mental illness because of my child. And there's something wrong with that picture, Doctor. And I'm afraid for America. I'm afraid that he needs some kind of help. I think he's a kind and decent man, but I think he set us on a dangerous course. And
let's leave it right there. Dr. Prentice, she made a couple of statements directly to you.
I'd agree that we need to be caring about every human life. That's why we're interested in protecting even embryonic human life. We're interested in protecting those who might be at the other end of their life. The statement was made that these little balls of cells don't think, don't feel. The same could be said about people with advanced Alzheimer's, people in coma. We're back to that slippery slope argument is, are we going to set aside one group of human beings because they're vulnerable and decide that they're fair game for research?
Dr. Teitelbaum, I asked how Dr. Prentice, how he responded to the vote in Congress. What was your thought on the vote and the result of it?
Well, first, this is not a Democrat-Republican issue, obviously. We have Orrin Hatch on us on the side. There are many people with very good conservative credentials who are advocates of all forms of stem cell research. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is an American issue. This is basically to say whether or not we as a society will be thinking about our most vulnerable patients, and it's also not a contest between various types of stem cells. Dr. Prentice and his associates say that this is where we can use one type of stem cell versus another. This is a contest between us as a society and disease. And I, as a physician, as a guy who sees patients with terrible bone diseases, my goal is to cure these people. These people like this unfortunate caller of her son who she just talked about, to cure them, regardless of what type of stem cells we use. I don't think that we should be making this a contest between stem cells. We should be fighting disease.
Silver Spring, Maryland.
Hi. I'm not really sure why the slippery slope argument keeps coming up, because it seems like this bill and other legislation calls for oversight by the National Academy of Sciences and NIH. So I feel that there are protections in place for this. But I guess the reason for my call is to let you know that I am a pro-life Republican, and I have been for many years. This issue has made me decide that on Monday morning I'm going into my voter registration office and I'm changing my party affiliation. I want to be able to vote for candidates who believe in this. I want to have an impact on the 2008 presidential election, and I'm tired of being affiliated with a party whose president cannot see the light of day on this issue. It's tragic, and it's unfortunate that it's going to take someone in his family being diagnosed with a very serious illness for him to even consider changing his position on this bill.
Dr. Prentice, you had
Well, and I would agree with what Dr. Teitelbaum said, that this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It's an issue that brings us to the table to say, what members of the human family will we include? What members will we not? The slippery slope comes in because, as I mentioned before, what this bill does is target a few embryos in the fertility clinics, the frozen embryos, the so-called leftovers, but those won't be enough. We've already heard that they won't be enough, which takes us to the next step of creating embryos specifically for research, whether by fertilization, you've got to solicit donors so that you can get the right genetic match, or by cloning, technically called somatic cell nuclear transfer. And in fact, on the floor of the House, Mr. Castle made a statement that cloning would be essential to move this research forward.
She talked about changing her vote. What are you seeing as we head to 2008 on this issue? Will this become a key issue?
I think it will be. We've seen it increase in terms of its importance over the last two election cycles. And I think once we reach 2008 and that presidential election cycle, it will be a more high-profile issue.
What about the candidates that have declared themselves both Republican and Democrat, how they stand on this, especially on the Republican side?
I think that might be a defining issue as people try to determine what candidate they'd vote for.
Dr. Teitelbaum, what do you see as far as 2009 or 2008 is concerned?
Well, Americans clearly consider this an important issue. I'm a doctor. I'm not a politician. I think that, that given the fact that I come from a very conservative state, and our conservative state passed a ballot initiative approving all forms of stem cell research that are approved by, that are not disapproved by the federal government. I think that if we can do it in Missouri, it can happen in many other places. So I agree. I agree with Dr. Prentice about this. It's going to be an important issue. But again, I'm a doctor and not a politician.
Hermitage, Pennsylvania.
Good morning. I think there's a lot of confusion surrounding this whole issue. I have 3 members of my family who have muscular dystrophy and who would benefit from maybe some of this research. However, you haven't addressed, as far as I can see, the notion that there is more success with adult stem cell research. Also, the fact that embryonic stem cell research produces tumors in animals that have been researched on. Could you address these, please?
Dr. Teitelbaum?
Yes. Unfortunately, Dr. Prentice and his colleagues have provided a lot of disinformation about adult stem cell research, and I know. I'm a guy who cured a disease with adult stem cells. I think that I sit uniquely around this table. I know about it. I cured a kid with a fatal bone disease using adult stem cells and was first ones to do it, but I can only cure less than 10% of those kids. You know, unfortunately, Dr. Prentice has published a paper saying that patients are successfully treated with Parkinson's disease, spinal cord injury, all sorts of diseases in which there was no evidence whatsoever. And we disprove these claims, and Dr. Prentice, he just kind of dismissed our statements as saying, well, this misinformation just happened to sneak into his claims. Well, you know, Dr. Prentice, you're playing with patients' lives. You're playing with my patients' lives. And there is nothing, as a physician, there is nothing more tragic than a patient with a devastating disease who has been misled, has disinformation, has been given promise that shouldn't be there. We're talking about promise with all forms of stem cells. Basically, adult stem cells are successful, and they are successful in the treatment of blood diseases, hematological diseases like lymphomas and leukemias. Claims about them being successful in the treatment of heart disease is just not true. It's not right, Dr. Prentice, to mislead patients.
Dr. Prentice.
The only thing, I'm glad that came up, the only thing that Dr. Teitelbaum and friends disproved about our statements were their own false statements about what we said. As he said, patients have improved, and that's what we keep saying. The patients have improved. There are hundreds of published scientific studies showing that patients have improved with adult and other non-embryonic stem cells for these various types of diseases. There are thousands of patients around the globe. Now, what Dr. Teitelbaum and friends tried to do was say we claimed that these were cures, that they're generally available. And we've never made that statement. But you go to any of these patients and ask them, have they improved? In fact, their doctors validate this. The published science validates this. The caller points out an important point. Scientifically, one of the problems in terms of this proposal of embryonic stem cells is the tumors. That's why it was very heartening to see this report from Wake Forest about the amniotic and placental stem cells that show that same flexibility as an embryonic stem cell, but without the tumor production.
Bradenton, Florida, good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to say to Dr. Prentice that most of the people that seem to take your stand on these issues are big supporters of the president, and he is says he's going to veto this bill if it goes through. Yet he's taken us into Iraq and killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, and I'm just curious what you people have against actual living beings.
Well, our position would be we really do want to help patients. We support all the types of stem cells except the type that destroys embryos. And again, the vast majority of published science shows that it is these adult and non-embryonic stem cells that are providing the patient improvement already. If you go to a website called clinicaltrials.gov and type in stem cell, what you'll see, I believe yesterday it was over 600 clinical trials ongoing. That's all with these adult type stem cells. Now again, those aren't cures at this point. That science is very early as well. But we're already seeing those first fruits where the patients have benefited, the patients have improved. And again, that's documented in the peer-reviewed science compared to what is being offered by Dr. Teitelbaum and those who support embryonic stem cells, which is frankly a lot of hype and misleading information that someday maybe they might provide a cure.
Well, he's doing it again. He's doing it again. Dr. Prentice, you know that patients have not been helped with Parkinson's disease. And you say in your document that you make claims on the basis of testimony before Congress and an abstract in a magazine. You say that testicular tumors have been treated. We're using a paper that has nothing to do with testicular tumors. Dr. Prentice, my patients suffer because of your statements. There are now patients going to Europe paying $30,000 to get a few stem cells placed into their body with no help whatsoever. 8 people who you quote in your paper have signed a statement disputing your claims about their science. I just don't understand how, in good conscience, you can continue to do this.
Let me
As a
quote
physician,
from Dr.
as a
Teitelbaum's
physician, it hurts me. It hurts the fact that you continue to use disinformation and to encourage patients who have these devastating diseases to use alternative forms of therapy and to bring their hopes up. It's just not
We
right.
don't support those particular offshore clinics where there is no published evidence. But what we have done is if you go to stemcellresearch.org, you can look at the actual published science, peer-reviewed papers, in terms of testicular cancer, in terms of another things which you disputed falsely in your opinion letter that was published. And in fact, you can look again and again and see that, as you said in your own supplement to that letter, patients showed improved long-term survival. Patients benefited. Patients improved. You can go again and again and again, your own words, in supposedly this letter that disputed our claims. And people have just to check the facts. We're bringing facts. We're bringing published science. You're bringing hype.
Let me hold you there. Let me take one more call. Greenwood, Indiana.
I just think that this is all affecting the bottom line because stem cells. I don't think the pharmaceutical companies want to cure any diseases because there's no profit in curing. There's just profit in treating. What about stem cell when it's getting close to being a prevention of diseases and stuff like that? It's like we're pulling the plug on it because we're afraid that it might cure a lot of diseases and that'll affect the bottom line for a lot of drug makers and healthcare industries.
I'm not interested in, I haven't made a penny for my advocacy. I'm not interested in money. I'm interested in curing people. Will there be jobs created if, in fact, this technology develops? Of course, there will be. That's what technology is all about. But those of us like me, like a physician who just cares about my patients, I'm not interested in any sort of benefit other than the fact that I don't have. Yesterday, I saw a child with this devastating disease that I told you that I was involved in the cure of. I saw a child, 8 months old. I had to say to that child's mother that it is unlikely, highly unlikely, that your child will live past the age of 5 because we cannot get the genetic match with the adult stem cells. I want to be able to say to that child's mother, we got a 90% chance of curing your kid. It really hurts as a doctor to have to say to somebody, to say to a parent, that your child is going to die in the first 5 years. That's what I'm after.
Dr. Prentice.
Well, we care about treating patients too, seeing them get better, eventually getting cures. But that's not going to come from embryonic stem cells. The published science, which Dr. Teitelbaum continues to ignore, is that the adult stem cells are the quickest and best hope for patients, and we'd like to see the resources go there.
Our guests have been Dr. David Prentice with the Family Research Council. He's their Senior Fellow for Life Sciences. Dr. Stephen Teitelbaum is with the Washington University School of Medicine based in St. Louis. To both of you gentlemen, thank you for coming by today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, we're going to take a look at unions and how they use their fees specifically for political purposes. We'll be right back.
Here's a look at the guests and topics to be discussed on this weekend's news and public affairs shows. This week, we'll host National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley and Democratic Representative John Murtha. Both will address the president's plan for Iraq. California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger will discuss his agenda for 2007. Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Barack Obama will appear on Face the Nation. The topic, the plan for Iraq. On Meet the Press, National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley. 4 senators will also appear on the program, Democratic Senators Christopher Dodd and Joe Lieberman, as well as Republican Senators John Kyle and Chuck Hagel. Fox News Sunday hosts Vice President Dick Cheney. And on Late Edition, Iraqi Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari, Pakistani Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz, and former Joint Chiefs Chairman General Richard Myers. Also on the show, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell and Democratic Senators Carl Levin and John Kerry. You can listen to the re-airs of these programs every Sunday beginning at noon Eastern Time on C-SPAN Radio.
Former Arkansas Governor Republican Mike Huckabee, Sunday on C-SPAN's Road to the White House 2008. Governor Huckabee speaks on his career, his potential run for the presidency, and his new book, From Hope to Higher Ground, 12 Stops to Restoring America's Greatness. Governor Mike Huckabee, Sunday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. on C-SPAN's Road to the White House 2008. Road to the White House is also available as a C-SPAN podcast.